As a leadership trainer, consultant, and coach, Marukian has devoted her career to helping leaders at every level to develop deeper self-awareness and confidence, create strong relationships, and develop skills to be successful in in business, federal government, nonprofit, and the private sector. With over 14 years of experience, Maria Marukian will guide you on developing the needed skills to be successful in your career goals. We have planned each of our one-hour webinars on strategic topics such as cross-cultural communications, developing self-awareness in the workplace, and how to work in a diverse work environment, managing your career successes. Each seminar is designed to build on the previous seminar to provide you all the building blocks to help you in your career. So before we get started, I just want to remind you of a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself on mute. We have over 100 people joining us today, and we do not want to hear all 100 people eating lunch. This will also help to eliminate any background noise during the presentation. We will also be recording this presentation for future viewing. And finally, as the webinar is taking place, please type your questions in the chat box. You'll find the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen towards the bottom. You can either send your question to the entire audience or directly to me at ACCA USA. These will be answered at the end of the presentation. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to Ms. Marukian.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. If you have any problems with the sound, please just raise your hand or type something in the chat box so that we can make sure to deal with that effectively. So thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. I'm so excited to see how many people have chosen to participate. For those of you who participated in our August session, this is going to be a little bit of a deeper dive into the conversation. We spoke in August, we had a session on exploring cross-cultural communication and some of the specific cultural norms that can sometimes show up in the workplace and create some challenges for us when it comes to our understanding of one another. And I wanted to focus this conversation today on this idea of self-awareness in a culturally diverse workplace, and to sort of think about how our own self-identity impacts the way that we show up at work, how we understand ourselves as well as others so that we can build stronger relationships across some of these cultural differences. So I wanted to start with a question for you all, and feel free to go ahead and just type your thoughts into the chat box. But what are some of the challenges that you personally experience when it comes to differences in cultural identity in the workplace? So let's hear from some folks. What are some of the specific challenges or issues that tend to crop up when it comes to, cultural differences in the workplace for you? Okay, so political correctness, language and intonation, okay, oversensitivity, communicating in the local language, interesting. We often in our cross-cultural courses talk about there are three kinds of people. There are people who are oversensitive because everything, they seem to care about all of these things that just aren't important to me. And then there are the people who are undersensitive because they don't seem to care about the things that I care about. And then there are the people who are just right because they care about exactly what I care about. So we'll talk a little bit about that notion of sensitivity. Okay, great. Being a woman and a Black person in North America, yeah, there is a very complex history around race and gender in our country that goes back hundreds of years, and it continues to impact us today. We'll talk a little bit about that. Local customs and practices. Let's see, it seems like a couple of people are still having some challenges with sound, so hopefully we'll be able to work that out. So yeah, I mean, these challenges are myriad and they're multidimensional. They can really span across a lot of different identity components. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today, is what are the different elements of our identity that can sometimes impact how we relate to one another in the workplace, and how can we build some stronger self-awareness as well as other awareness. So why does cultural identity matter in the workplace? I think just by the nature of the list that that you all have put out there, it crops up, right? It does create some challenges for us. We bring our identities to work with us. As much as we like to believe that we leave our emotions and our identities and our values at the door when we come into the office, that's just not the case. It's with us constantly. It's kind of like the software that's running in the back of our mind. I think we spoke about that in our session in August. And we often face moments of what I call cultural dissonance at work, where we may not necessarily always even realize that it's related to cultural identity, but we have disconnects with people. We have those abrasion moments where we don't quite feel like we are, at the very least, we don't feel like we're communicating effectively, and sometimes at the most we don't feel valued, we don't feel represented, we don't feel like we fit. And the third reason is that the leaders of today and tomorrow really need to be able to understand and manage themselves and others to build more effective working relationships. And this isn't just it's not just about being nice. It's not just about, you know, making everybody happy. There is a significant body of research that shows that leaders who develop a good sense of self-awareness and an ability to manage themselves and their trigger responses more effectively, leaders who are able to empathize and take on the perspective of others actually are much higher performers. They have teams that tend to have not only higher levels of motivation and engagement in the workplace, but they also get higher performance levels. So there is a direct business, you know, bottom line when it comes to building self-awareness, building strong relationships across some of these identity differences. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about identity, and you know, we talked about this notion of a culturally diverse workforce. In the context of this conversation, we define diversity as all of the elements of our identity that make us similar to and different from one another. So it is everything from race, gender, ethnicity, national origin, native language, a lot of the things that folks were mentioning in the chat. It's also things like parental status. It is economic background. It's religion, personality. All of these elements that make us either feel an affinity toward others because we see a similarity, or feel different from others because we don't feel like they share that aspect of our identity. And we need all of that diversity within the organizational environment to truly be innovative and high performing. There's a great quote I love here about this notion of self-awareness by Catherine Mansfield. "I want, by understanding myself, to understand others." And I think that's really sort of at the heart of our focus here today, is that in order for us to develop these relationships, we have to start with ourselves. We have to understand ourselves, our own sort of frame of reference, our own cultural norms, values, expectations, and our own blind spots. All of us have, as we'll talk about in a little while, social blind spots. There are things that we just sort of believe to be the truth and reality, which when we pull back, we can recognize that we're only looking at things through one lens. Okay. So some of the different dimensions of identity that that I touched upon, there are sort of different layers. So when you look at our very core is our personality. Each individual has their own sort of innate temperament, personal preferences, personality indicators that for the most part we're born with and may or may not change over the course of our lives, but each of us is sort of a unique individual. For any of you who have siblings, you probably grew up in the same family structure, within the same community, went to the same schools perhaps, had similar friends, came from experienced similar religious and socioeconomic and academic experiences, and yet I know for me and for many folks that I've talked with, they sometimes look at that sibling and say, gosh, we see the world so differently. So just by the nature of our own unique personalities, we can sometimes have very different perspectives and ways of seeing the world. Then this orange layer, the second layer, sort of I refer to that as our core elements of our identity. These are the aspects of our identity that, for the most part, we are born with and don't necessarily change over the course of our lives, or we don't necessarily have too much control over these aspects of our identity. This is just who we are. Age, ethnicity, race, gender, physical and mental ability, national origin. I am a particular age, and that's going to continue to grow even when I reach a point where I no longer want to get any older. I don't have much control over that. And the same with some of these other elements, that they're sort of unchangeable or out of our control. This yellow layer of our identity is what I refer to as the more dynamic layer. So these are elements of our identity that perhaps do change over the course of our lives. Our academic experiences, we may have a little bit more freedom of choice over what we want to focus on, what we choose to study. Religion, we may grow up in a particular religious environment, but that may change over the course of our lives. We typically have choice over that. Socioeconomic status may change over the course of our lives. Our marital, parental status, our friendships, the languages that we speak. Will always have our native language, but we may pick up other ones as we go throughout life. And of course, personal interests and hobbies and things of that nature. So with both of these, both the orange and the yellow dimensions of identity, both of these layers can play a significant impact on our personal values, our beliefs, our expectations, our modes of communication, but we don't necessarily always realize that they have such an impact on us, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then finally, this blue layer is the organizational layer, and I think this is an important one for us to touch upon, especially if we're thinking about a culturally diverse workplace, because it's not only the elements of our personal identities, but also how we self-identify or how we are identified within one particular organizational culture. In any particular organization, work location, our professional backgrounds or interests, our management status, the job function that we actually have in our roles and responsibilities, as well as seniority or tenure, can all play a role in how we perceive ourselves and how we're perceived by others within any given organizational culture. So as you can see here, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the dimensions of identity that exist, but there is a lot of complexity. We are multidimensional when it comes to our identities, and all of these different elements are working in combination to influence our perspectives of the world. All of these dimensions of identity also play a role in how others perceive us, which is what I'd like to talk about next. So if you think about an iceberg, the notion of an iceberg, there's the old adage that, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason for that is that the iceberg, only about 10% is actually visible above the waterline. And everything else is under the water. The large part of the iceberg is under the water, as the members of the Titanic, unfortunately, found out a little too late. But you know, the same sort of analogy applies when we think about our identity. There are certain aspects of our identity that may be visible to others, such as our physical appearance, sometimes maybe our age, or, you know, general sort of age group. Gender sometimes can be visible above the waterline. But there's not a whole lot when we really peel it back that we can tell about somebody just by seeing them Perhaps if they speak, we know their, we know their language, or we perhaps can guess that we know that they're not from a particular, from a native, native of that particular land if they have an accent. But above and beyond that, it's really difficult for us to gain much insight into a person's identity based on what we can physically see. And yet so often we make sweeping assumptions about people based on this very limited data about what's visible to us. What is underneath the water line is much larger and more and richer and more complex. When we think about all of those other elements of one's identity that are not necessarily visible to people but say so much about who we are and how we see the world, everything from our religion and our socioeconomic background to our family history, to our personal experiences, to our personalities, to sometimes our physical and mental abilities if they're not necessarily visible to others, our values, our expectations, our beliefs, the list goes on, right? And that's the stuff that we need to understand about ourselves and others, because it's often not what is seen, but it tells so much more of a person's story. So I want to talk a little bit about this notion about what's visible and what's invisible. I have a few pictures that I want to show you. And these are going to be some profiles of individuals who we'll visit them here, and then we'll also visit a couple of them a little bit later. What I'd like you to do is take a few notes on your immediate impression of each individual. So just what do you see? What immediate impression or story do you create about this particular person in your mind? Now, you don't necessarily need to think too much about it. I really want this to be your instinctual reaction to this person. What do you notice about them from the very beginning, and what's sort of the story or the inference that you make about this individual? So just take a couple of notes for yourself. You don't necessarily need to share them with us, but we'll come back to each of these folks, okay? So here's the first one. This is Susanna. And I'm just going to put her up on the screen for a couple of seconds while you take a few notes. Okay, and we're going to move on to the next one. I'll give you a moment to look at this person and write down your notes, your immediate inferences about this individual. Okay, this is person number 3, Amy. And this is the last one, Alina. Okay, so let's do this. I would like to open it up to folks in the chat. So we're going to look below the surface. I'd like to open it up in the chat. We're going to look again at these 4 individuals, and please feel free to type just your immediate impressions. What were a couple of the things that you wrote down about each of these individuals? So let's start with Susanna. Just in the chat, type anything that you identified. Susanna looks like she could be an artist. Okay, thank you, Wafa. Interesting. She feels good about herself. She loves fashion. Artist, fashion model, confident, stylish, and looks serious. Reserved, sad. So very interesting how we already noticed that there are a number of different impressions of her emotional emotional state, her personality. Great. She looks like she's living in NYC. Reserved, arms folded, self-confident. So, you know, even her stance, her physical posture and body language represent very different things to different people. Conservative, protective, defensive, relaxed, really, really interesting, vulnerable. So almost completely 180-degree opposite descriptions of this particular individual based on just what you see. All right, so I'm going to read you a little bit about Susanna. This is the story of Susanna. She grew up in Minnesota. She was the only African-American family. Hers was the only African-American family in her neighborhood. And because of that, they faced quite a bit of adversity when it came to fitting in within their community, which was mostly white. Her family was middle class. So she grew up with, you know, pretty comfortable lifestyle in terms of her socioeconomic background. Susanna has a sister who's severely autistic, and she often feels like she should be helping her parents more with her sister's care, especially now that they're getting older. So she carries like a good deal of guilt about living far away and not being able to help her family more with her sister's condition. Her parents always put a really big focus on education for Susanna because they wanted their daughter to succeed. And so she's always felt a sense of obligation, especially because her other sister has had so many struggles in her life, and she really feels like she needs to be successful in order to do her parents proud. Susanna also is an introvert. She often doesn't speak up in meetings, even when she does have a strong opinion about something, because she just doesn't feel comfortable in the moment voicing those opinions. She also often feels alienated and even invisible at work because she's a younger woman of color. She works mostly with middle-aged, highly educated, upper-middle-class white men from the U.S. and from Europe, and so she often feels like she just not only doesn't fit in, but is almost completely isolated from the majority culture within her organization. So based on what you heard about Susanna's profile, how does that change your perspective of her? Just put some thoughts into the chat. What's coming up for you now? Oh, Lukemi says, not as confident. So maybe kind of appearing like she's really confident, but under the surface, maybe not as much. Lenwer says empathy. Joanna says it doesn't change. She looked at her as reserved, following rules, sad. Okay. You know, it's interesting that word empathy. She wants to show in the pic who she is, her strength. Yeah. So it's fascinating how, you know, sometimes we can pick up on certain things about people from their facial expressions, but we can also make some pretty large assumptions about them. When we know more of their story, when we know more of their background, all of a sudden their facial expressions, their behaviors, their body language, there's a new light around it. We can understand it and even have some more compassion for that individual. Wonderful. She seems more sensitive from the description than the picture. Interesting. Yeah, and Teresa, thank you. Compassion, right? We can sometimes, and I think that's one of the most important elements to this work is when we know a little bit more about what's under the surface, when we know more about a person's story, all of a sudden we see their humanity much more fully than we do when we're just looking at what's visible. Okay, So let's do the next one. So in the chat, what do you think about Doug? Give us some inferences. What's the story you're telling yourself or the impression you have of Doug? Relaxed, carefree. Okay. Yeah, he's looking pretty good about himself. Director, he loves golf. I love it. Boring. Relaxed, high pride, professional, upper middle class. Confident, but not fully. Lots of people saying confident. All right. Cynical, Lenworth. Wow. Family man, Yunla says. So lots of people saying confident. A few folks kind of saying he looks like he's, you know, definitely a businessman. Got a lot of, got a lot going for him. Polite. Coach or psychologist. Oh, interesting. Okay. Open-minded. Easygoing. Yeah, love. He seems very relaxed, right? Very in his element. Dominate. Ah, interesting. Look, and again, look at the differences in our perspectives of this person based on what we can see. We're getting everything from dominate, kind of full of himself, to easy to approach and friendly and open-minded. So really interesting how we can see. Oh, Joanna, I love that you think this is fun. Good. So yeah, it's really interesting how we can get such different impressions. Okay, so let's hear Doug's story. Doug was born and raised in the rural Midwest. His family was pretty poor growing up. They were in the rural area, not a whole lot of income in their community, and their family really struggled. He actually was raised by his grandparents because his parents were teenagers when his mother got pregnant, and neither she nor her boyfriend at that time were equipped to care for a child. So the grandparents essentially raised him from the time he was a baby. He's a devout Christian, went to church and continues to go to church every Sunday. He was the first in his family to go beyond high school, actually the first in his family to graduate high school and then go on to get his graduate degree. When Doug was young, he was in a serious accident that left him partially deaf in one ear. So it's really hard for him to understand folks who speak softly or have an accent. He's always felt like he has to work extra hard to prove himself because of his upbringing, and sort of growing up in a low-income area. So there's a sense of insecurity, and he tries to overcome that by sort of having this looking the part, surrounding himself with material things, driving expensive cars, wearing expensive clothes, because he had nothing growing up. So having those material things is status for him, but also he feels like that gives him a little bit more credibility than he's ever had in the past. So now that you know the story of Doug, tell me a little bit about how you're thinking of him differently. Just go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat. What do you think about Doug now? A gentleman. Ah. Quiet, reserved, introverted. More serious experience than you thought. Joanna, yeah. Wanting to impress others. So again, we never can tell. Felt he was covering something from his look, but still the same feeling he's rich and loves golf. Very, very well may be true, Amalia. Absolutely. Not what you expected. Does he love golf? That's actually not in the story, but he very well might love golf, Amalia. Again, we sometimes can correctly read people's nonverbals without knowing the story. And sometimes we can really misconstrue people's body language or behaviors because we don't know their stories. So, always really interesting to sort of get at what else is behind this person, right? Okay, let's move on to Amy. So go ahead and just write a couple of thoughts about Amy. What's the story that you have about her? Professional, Lots of people, yeah, professional businesswoman. She believes in her future. Pleasant, outgoing, serious, beautiful, professional looking, nice but aggressive, young, aggressive professional lady, warm, optimist, apprehensive, goal-oriented. So again, we've got sort of all ends of the spectrum. Everyone sees her as a professional. Some folks see her as warm and approachable. Other folks see her as aggressive. Very interesting. Lawyer, businesswoman, hardworking, salesperson, corporate climber. I love it. Confident. Lots of people saying confident. Okay, so let's hear Amy's story. Amy spent her early childhood in foster homes, being bounced from one family to another because her mom suffered from mental illness. She was adopted and lived with a wonderful family, and she's worked really hard to get where she is today, overcoming a lot of obstacles because of a learning disability, as well as dealing with depression and anxiety order. She tries to hide her insecurities and challenges behind a tough exterior and feels like she gains credibility with others when she's firm and stands her ground. She believes in the notion of saying what you mean and driving hard to get your way, but she still often finds herself feeling very insecure and needing to hide who she truly is. So what are you thinking about Amy now? Yinla says good cover up. Yeah, still professional. A lot of people, looking at her dress, struggling, confidence. Don't judge a book by its cover. Thank you, Judith. Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes, we can sense certain things about people even if they're not portraying it, but we can still often kind of make stories in our heads about who people are without knowing the fullness. And I think going back again to that idea of what compels this person, if her behaviors come across as ambitious and assertive or even aggressive, some people can have a very negative reaction to that. But when we know the story behind that behavior, what's driving that person, what causes them to act that way, it can sometimes lead to a very different perspective of that individual. Yeah, great, Joanna. Aggressive does not need to be bad. Absolutely. It's just how do we sometimes, what are the assumptions that we make about people when they behave in certain situations? Great. All right, so let's go to our final one. Alina, say a little bit about your, what are your immediate sort of inferences or assumptions about this person? Friendly, happy, innocent, nice girl student, international student from Asia, lovely person, confident, easy, friendly, looks like she's from Japan, caregiver, maybe a dancer or teacher. Oh, interesting. Okay. Good family background, smart. So interesting, isn't it? How we see a person's face and maybe a little bit of what they're wearing, and we make so many, we make a lot of assumptions about them. Student, she's happy, not many issues, maybe from China, uncertain. Okay, so let's hear Alina's story. Alina is from Central Asia. She speaks 4 languages fluently. Her father had a pretty high posting in a government ministry in her home country. She grew up with the belief that your actions speak for you, and bragging or bringing attention to yourself is disrespectful and pompous. But her travels and experiences living abroad have helped her to understand that she needs to promote herself, especially in Western cultures, in a more assertive way. She does find herself often really aggravated by how little her U.S. colleagues, her neighbors, her friends know or have any curiosity about her homeland. If she hears one more person ask her some dumb question, like whether she's ever seen a washing machine or had internet where she came from, she's going to scream. All right, so how are you thinking about Alina now? Joanna has a smiley face. I love it. Still smart? Yin Loss is close to your thoughts. Pretentious. Lenmer says you can relate to that. Any others? Confident, cautious. Okay. So, again, we can look at people and sometimes have some accuracy in the way that we perceive them, but we don't know the full story. In-loss is quite common, as you've heard a lot of people like this. Yeah, absolutely. So I think these stories speak to the experiences, understanding people's life experiences, both their positive and negative experiences impact the way that they see the world. So I want to sort of go there next and look at why this matters. Looking under the surface, why should we be doing this more? We're all more than just a stereotype of our cultural identity. I'm going to venture the guess that everybody on this webinar has at some point felt like they were misjudged because of some aspect of their cultural identity. I know that I have. And so it's important for us to see people beyond what's just the tip of the iceberg. Individuals have unique identities that shape how they see and interact in the world. We'll talk about that in a few moments. And by sharing and understanding one another's stories, we discover who people really are, which requires us to be open to not only hearing other people's stories, but also put ourselves in a vulnerable place sometimes where we're willing to share our own stories and perspectives. We've talked about this before, but I think this is such an important idea. This actually is a Talmudic proverb. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. We all look at the world through our own individual lenses, and we believe that that is the truth, that that's the reality, but it's true. It's our perceptions which become our reality. Our values, our beliefs, our cultural identities, even our emotional state at any particular point in time, goals and expectations, communication style, past experiences, all of this can impact the way that we view the world around us. And yet, oftentimes, we have what I call the illusion of objectivity. When we believe that we're looking at what's reality, we believe that we are making decisions based on objective data, and that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of research that shows that we often are making decisions based on our intuitive and emotional judgments. So being able to recognize our blind spots is really important. Just like we have visual blind spots when we're driving, everybody has certain social blind spots, which causes us to make judgments based on what's immediately visible and to often miss or even ignore crucial information about others. So even when we do sometimes have more information that's available to us, sometimes we'll discount it or just kind of not even notice that it's there. And that can cause us to have a very different understanding of a person, of a situation. And what becomes even more challenging is when we take action based on these inferences. So that's what I want to talk about next. I want to give you a model that I think is really helpful in considering how we make these inferences. So the ladder of inference, this is a model that was created by Harvard professor Chris Argyris back in, I believe, the 1970s, but I think it still carries a lot of weight today. So with the ladder of inference, if you think about any time you are facing a situation with other individuals, there's all of this available data, all of this observable data that is out there for us. And instinctually, we can't always use all of that data to make decisions, so we select certain elements of data. And typically we select data that is meaningful and relevant to us based on those cultural lenses that we looked at earlier. Based on the data that we select, we make meaning of that data. Here's where we start to add in our own sort of story making about the data that we've selected. And then we start to create assumptions based on the meaning that we've added. We start to solidify those assumptions into conclusions that this is just the way it is, and then it becomes our beliefs that we either generate or reinforce, which becomes then, this is the truth, this is the reality. And if other people don't see this reality, then there's something wrong with them. And then finally, we take action based on those beliefs. So this is completely human, right? This is the way our brains work. It's instinctual, and to be honest, it's important because it's the only way for us to make decisions in our lives. We do need to rely on our intuition and our past experiences in order to understand the world around us. And the more experiences we have, oftentimes the easier or more quickly we're able to make decisions. What becomes really challenging with the ladder of inference is when it's a complex situation with other individuals who may be looking at the same situation through a very different lens. And when we only walk up that ladder and look at things from our perspective, then we are often missing critical information that could lead us to take very different action. On top of that, what we tend to do when we generate these beliefs is that this becomes kind of reflexive. My beliefs then influence the data that I select in the future. So this becomes then sort of solidified in my mind, that software running in the back of my mind, and instead of walking up the ladder of inference, the next time that I experience a situation that is similar, I run up that ladder, and it causes me to take action much more quickly. Let's look at some examples of what this might look like in the workforce. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. We're going to go back to some of our friends that we talked about earlier in these profiles. Let's start with Doug. And I'm going to, I'll let you know in advance that this is actually based on a similar situation that I faced as a leader myself, which is kind of ironic, being a diversity trainer and doing this stuff for a living. It's humbling to know that even though I preach this to other people, I sometimes struggle with recognizing my own blind spots. All right, so out of all of the data selected, here's the data that I select about Doug in this particular situation. All right, Doug, let's see here, where's Doug? Doug started talking while I was talking yesterday in a meeting, and I was sharing an idea that I had, and he interrupted and just started arguing and sharing his own idea. And I've also noticed that he's done this with a couple of my ideas in the past. So that's the data I've selected out of the mountain of available data that's out there. What meaning might I make from this situation? Doug interrupted me because he doesn't like my ideas. Right? So out of the select data that I have here, now I'm starting to add my own mental model to that. He doesn't like my ideas, and that's why he interrupted me. Then I start to draw some assumptions about that. Doug does not respect my opinions. So now we're really getting into some ambiguous territory based on my emotional reaction to Doug's behavior. Conclusions. Doug does not respect me. So now I've gone from he doesn't respect my opinions to he does not respect me as a person. And now I come to beliefs. Doug is disrespectful. And I take action on that. I'm going to avoid him, and I'm going to tell all my colleagues that he's a jerk. Now, of course, this is a simplistic model just to show you how we walk up the ladder, but this is the kind of thing that happens all the time, day in and day out, and it happens within a couple of seconds, that we start to make these jumps, these mental leaps, and then we solidify them as our beliefs and take action based on that. Now, the additional challenge to the ladder of inference is that based on my actions, Doug is going to walk up his own ladder of inference. So Doug notices that I'm avoiding him. He overheard that I was talking about him to some of my colleagues and making some negative comments. So now he's going to start walking up his own ladder of inference based on the action that he observed from me. And he's going to make meaning of that. He's going to draw assumptions and conclusions and beliefs. And all of a sudden, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And Doug and I end up not having a very good relationship with each other because we're both missing critical elements to our stories. Okay, let's see what happens. The ladder of inference does not always have to be about negative situations or negative perspectives. sometimes it's positive, right? Sometimes we have positive inferences or associations with people that also can not give us the whole side of the story. So let's look at Alina. The data I select, Alina smiled at me and said hello to me this morning, and she recently proposed a new idea for a project and volunteered to lead it. And so that really just, that really resonated with me. So the meaning I add, Alina is enthusiastic about this project and she likes me as her boss. You see where I'm starting to add some stuff here? So not only is she enthusiastic, but she really likes me. Now I'm going to take it one step further. I'm going to make some assumptions. Not only is Alina enthusiastic about the project, but I'm assuming now that she's qualified to run this project, and I'm predicting that we're going to have a great working relationship. Conclusions, Alina is a high potential performer. Beliefs, she's the best performer on my team. Action, I give her more high-profile projects and help her get a promotion. Now again, you see how I made a huge mental leap from she's enthusiastic to she's qualified to she's the best performer on my team. I have no data in this ladder to back that up other than the fact that she smiled, said hello, and proposed a new idea for the project. She might not have any idea what she's doing. She may not, but that's not relevant to me in this moment when I'm running up the ladder. It's based on my own emotional reaction and my affinity for Alina. Now again, we often can find ourselves in situations where our actions are observed not only by this person, but by others. So not only is Alina viewing my behaviors, but so are others. So let's say that Alina and Doug work together. Alina might think, Maria's the best boss ever. She's really going out of her way to give me so many opportunities. This is great. Doug might be looking at my behaviors and saying, gosh, Maria's giving Alina preferential treatment. She's treating me with disdain. She's talking trash about me, but she's giving Alina all these opportunities. I'm a better performer than Alina. And maybe even Doug goes so far as to say, I think I need to talk to human resources about Maria as a boss. So we really have to be thoughtful of how not only there's the assumptions that we're making about others, but also thinking about how our actions are going to be perceived by others. Oh, great point brought up. Yin said, you have direct reports feeling you were disrespectful because you didn't agree with their thoughts. So yeah, again, it's everybody's walking up their ladder of inference in one way or another, right? And it's important for us to find ways to walk back down that ladder. So why does this happen? We often create narratives in our minds about situations without seeking out all of the observable data, as we talked about. We believe those narratives to be the truth. Alina is a fantastic performer. I'm not selecting data that tells me otherwise, right? I'm only selecting data that reinforces my belief that Alina is my top performer. We assume the truth is obvious and expect others to share those same views. Everybody in the office should also see and believe that Alina is the best performer. And if somebody doesn't, well, then there's something wrong with them, right? And we continue to seek data to support our beliefs, even when new information is brought to our attention that challenges those truths. This is what we call confirmation bias. So a lot of times the idea of our beliefs being challenged is so uncomfortable for us that we will literally discount or ignore new information that could indicate that our beliefs are not necessarily 100% accurate, in order for us to hold fast to that belief of ourselves and others. So it's really important for us to find ways to walk back down the ladder, especially when others are observing our actions and then they're walking up their own ladder of inference. What are some real-life implications when you think of these stories that we create with these what are the real-life implications when it comes to the ladder of inference? Well, I mean, first and foremost, we make inaccurate judgments of colleagues, supervisors, and employees when we're not taking the time to select more from that pool of observable data. Can lead to disconnects in our communication with one another. It can have a huge erosion of our trust on our team and our relationships. It can sometimes lead to perceptions of unfair or preferential treatment. It can lower levels of morale and motivation if people feel like they're not understood or valued. It can sometimes lead to untapped employee potential. As we saw, Doug might be the best the best person for a project, but I'm assigning it to Alina simply because I like her and I think she likes me. It can also lead, as we covered a little bit earlier, to some human resource issues, which we would probably rather not have in our lives. So some thoughts for walking back down the ladder. I think it's really important for us to go back to the, walk back down to the bottom and look for that observable data. Sometimes by simply asking ourselves and others some questions, we can start to put things in a different perspective and get out of that space of confirmation bias. So I try in any situation, especially if I feel like there's some sort of cultural dissonance or identity dissonance, I ask myself, what assumptions am I making here? Because it is absolutely a given that if I'm emotionally triggered, I'm going to have some assumptions. I'm going to be looking through my own lens and looking for information that reinforces what I already believe about myself and others. What information am I missing or ignoring? What might be happening from the other person's perspective? This is where empathy and compassion, as you all mentioned earlier, really comes into play. So important for us to be able to look at things from the other perspective. There are so many so many times that we talk about walk a mile in another person's shoes, and yes, absolutely, we all believe in that, and yet it can sometimes be so difficult for us to do. So just taking a step back and asking ourselves, this isn't to excuse another person's behavior if it's having a negative impact on us, but it is to understand it before we have that conversation so that we know that we're making the right choices. Also asking ourselves, how might we be contributing to this situation? I often like to remind myself and others that in any given situation, I am someone else's leadership challenge because of my behaviors, because of my beliefs, because of my values. And so I have to think about how at any point in time I might be contributing to the challenges that I am facing. What are the potential implications of my actions? So rather than jumping right off the top of that ladder and engaging in behavior that could be potentially detrimental to my relationships, taking a step back and considering the implications of those actions. And then thinking about what's the outcome I want to have. Sometimes we can reach very different results when we take a step back and think about what's most important to me, what's the outcome that I would like to have with this other individual or in this particular situation. Okay, I want you to think about someone at work with whom you have had cultural dissonance. And this is going to be an individual activity. You don't necessarily need to share in the chat pod, but I just want you to take a few moments to think about how you might be walking up the ladder of inference with that individual. So think of somebody that maybe you've had a little bit of conflict or tension with, or you just kind of look at them and think, they don't get it, right? What is the narrative that you might be creating in your mind about that person? And what data might you be missing? And if you walk back down that ladder, how might you build a better relationship with that person? So I'm just going to give you a moment to ponder those questions. If you want to write them down and think about them after the session, we'll also make the PowerPoint slides available to you. But we all have that one person that sort of just rubs us the wrong way, creates that abrasion. So what else might be causing that person's behavior? What might be behind it? And to Teresa saying, reflecting humility and compromise to the team. Yeah, such an important element to this, right? I don't, at any given point in time, I don't necessarily have the right answer. And being willing to acknowledge that and then tap into the collective wisdom of the team, ask questions so that I understand the meaning and of another person's actions and what value they bring to the team. Something as simple as just shifting our mindset. so often when we get locked into that ladder of inference, we tend to, again, we pull our emotions into it and we make judgments about a person and their character, either for better or for worse, rather than looking at the behaviors of that person and trying to understand the cause of those behaviors. Tayeb says more communication. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating how, there's a lot of research that backs this up. It seems so simple, but just by spending more time with a particular individual or a particular group, again, we develop that bond. We see them as human beings rather than the frustration that is coming our way. Teamwork spirit, yeah, absolutely. Motivating team members, really, really important. And people can feel when you are genuine in your desire to understand them, when you're genuine in your desire to build relationships, people can sense that. Empowering team members, great, thank you, absolutely. Taking the time to build relationships, to understand people, to question our own sort of narratives that we're making up about a situation is really important. So I just want to go quickly, a little summary of some things that you can do to manage cultural dissonance at work. And this is not only for your relationship with your direct reports, but also relationships with colleagues, relationships with supervisors. We probably all have had a supervisor that we've walked up the ladder of inference around them and their behaviors once or twice. So this works regardless of our relationships with others, both professionally and personally. First and foremost, just pause. That notion of self-awareness starts with giving ourselves some space to question what's going on with me right now? How am I feeling? How am I reacting to the situation? And how is that impacting the way that I see the situation? So giving ourselves some space. There's a reason why people have been practicing deep breathing for thousands of years. Because it gives it physiologically lowers our blood pressure and our heart rate, and it gives our brain some time to tap into the logical, rational functioning part of our mind, and that helps us to make more informed decisions and sort of stop before we jump off that ladder of inference. And empathy, a number of you mentioned that in the chat pod, taking the time to understand where others are coming from. Again, this doesn't mean that we are abdicating people of accountability for their actions, but it is about trying to understand them. Inquiry, taking time to ask some questions and really inquiring both about ourselves and how we're contributing to the situation, as well as inquiring of others what's going on for them. And then finally, seeking mutually beneficial outcomes. When we look again at what's the result that I want to achieve, a number of you mentioned focusing on the team, focusing on the needs of the team, empowering the team. So when we take a step back and think about things, not just from the lens of what I want, what I need, but from the lens of what's in the best interest of our group, we tend to approach our problems in a very different way. So I want to stop there. I know that we just have a couple of minutes to wrap things up, but if anybody has any questions, this is such a deep and rich topic, and there's only so much we can cover in 60 minutes, but I would love to hear any questions or comments that you have, and also if you would like to share them after the session, I would be happy to answer them if we're not able to get to them today. So please feel free to type in the chat if you have any questions or comments. And I want to thank you all for your engagement and your great insights throughout this session today. Oh, Olukemi, yeah, great question. How to deal with difficult people, even when you've tried to empathize. The challenge for us at any given point in time is that we can't change other people, right? We can't force them to change. We can only change ourselves, and so it does require us to sometimes, keep trying to empathize, but at the same time, that accountability factor, I also need to make sure that I'm looking out for myself and holding others accountable for their actions. So it's a little bit of a delicate balance, but I think, you know, it has to start with ourselves, right? You see that something, let me see here, something is not okay, but the person is avoiding conflicts. Or a person avoids to admit there's anything and avoid open conversation. Yeah, that is really challenging. I think we can't force people to talk to us if they're not willing to, and people aren't necessarily going to feel free to divulge information about themselves. So I think it's sort of keeping the door always open for others, showing by example, by demonstrating. You don't need to share your entire life history with people, but looking for common ground, I think, can sometimes be a good starting place. We disagree on everything, but what can we agree on? And sometimes just by asking that question of the other person, or maybe putting it out there, here's where I think I do see some agreement with us, that can sometimes lead to that same sense of compassion and humanity. If you encounter a very sensitive person who's not sharing with you, not open and misunderstanding you, what would you do? Great question, Teresa. Yeah, again, I think it's starting from where can we seek some common ground? Are there some outcomes that we can both agree on? Do we have a common goal that we can start from? And then sometimes just getting a little bit deeper into where do we actually disagree? Like what is it that is causing us to see things from such a different perspective? Sometimes finding language that takes out the sensitivity piece, the emotional piece, and focuses on, you know, I think it's really important for us to have a good working relationship with each other. I know I'm committed to it. I think you are too. You know, what do we need to do? What do we both need to agree upon in order for us to work effectively together? So something about bringing together that we, using language that focuses on we instead of you versus me can be useful, because, you know, we're helping people to overcome, you know, that us versus them mentality that can sometimes play out with the ladder of inference. Oh, wow. So many good questions coming in, and I know we probably won't have time to get to them all, but maybe there's a way for us to gather them, and then I can give some responses after the fact.
Maria, you can just go ahead and answer maybe one more question, and then we'll have to close this out. And we can see about getting, compiling all the rest of the questions and getting some answers to you, and perhaps in an email after.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw somebody mentioned question of dealing with people who do not see change as necessary. That's a big one. I will definitely take that offline, but I think, you know, going back to some of the things that we were talking about, often we see where change is necessary, but others might not, because they're looking from a different lens, and change can bring a lot of emotional reactions with it. So empathy is a really important element to that, not only to show people we care, but also it's data gathering. Empathy is strategic, people. It's not just about making people feel good. That's an important part of it too, relationship building, but empathy also, it is about inquiry. The more I empathize, the more I ask questions to try to understand where you're coming from, that's more data that I'm gathering, so I can make more informed decisions about what's most important to you, what would motivate you to, you know, to buy into the change process. So I'm happy to share more resources about that, because it is a very important and very big topic, and I'll also look through the other questions and try to respond to as many as I can after the fact. And thank you all for a great webinar.
Thank you, Maria. It was very insightful, and I hope everyone really enjoyed it. It looks like you did, based on the participation, so that's great. So I just want to let you know that our next and final webinar of this series will be February 15th. There is some possibility of doing this in the evening if that works better for folks, but for now we will stick to the 12:30, 1:30 time slot and send out invites in January. If you have any questions, you can please feel free to contact us at accca.usa@acccaglobal.com. That's accca.usa@acccaglobal.com. And we will be you will have access actually to the webinar, to the recording in about 24 hours, and we will see about getting answers to some of these last questions that we were not able to address. So thank you again, happy holidays, and hope to see you all in February. Thanks.